Hi everyone, it's Lauren. I hope you're all doing really well. We are almost, just about, halfway through the year now. So that means it's time for me to talk about all of the books that I have enjoyed reading most for the first half of 2019. As always, these are books that I just happen to have read so far this year. These aren't necessarily books that have been published in 2019. And they're all linked in the description box below as well if you would like to check any of them out further, which I, of course, highly recommend that you do. So I'm going to talk about these in the order in which I read them, so these aren't necessarily ranked in order of preference. The first two I'm going to talk about here is a little bit of a cheat because these are part of a series, so I've kind of clubbed them together, and they are The Girl in the Tower and The Winter of the Witch, which is a proof copy, rubbish version, by Catherine Arden, and these are the second and third books in the Winter Night trilogy. I read the first one in October last year and then finished these off in January early this year. This series is set in a medieval Russia, or the lands that will eventually become Russia, and we follow a young girl called Vasia who has these magical witchy type abilities, so all of the different little creatures and fabled beings that live in the households, Russian households, and in the woods, in the forests, she can see these beings and interact with them. And the plot I can't talk about too much in these books, especially because they're obviously a continuation of the story, but the entire trilogy focuses on her essentially beating down the patriarchal society and against expectations of her as a young girl, which are either that she will marry or become a nun, and she doesn't want to do either of those things. I enjoyed this trilogy a whole lot more than I expected to, actually. I got really swept up in the magic of it, in Vasia as a main character and the rest of her family and the characters in the books. What I also really enjoyed was the way that we're looking at traditional views of men against women and the expectations that are on Vasia, but it's also looking at the past versus the present and the future, and religion versus the old kind of pagan beliefs that Russian people had. And I really enjoyed reading about a time and place that I haven't read much fiction in either. So if you haven't picked these up yet, I wouldn't actually recommend reading them right now, especially if you're in the Northern Hemisphere in the middle of summer, but when it is winter, if you haven't tried them yet, I'd highly recommend giving them a go because they are so atmospheric. Next we have a book of short stories, which is A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan. Now the stories in this collection are linked together because there is an overall framework within all the stories, and that is that there are two women who are about to have a baby, and they've both decided that they are not going to tell the baby anything that isn't true. So that means a ban on all fairy tales. However, both of them are breaking this ban in secret. So the woman that's pregnant, she tells the baby stories while her partner's at work, and the woman who isn't pregnant tells the baby stories while her partner's asleep. So you get these different fairy tales which are they're kind of set in modern Scotland, but they also feel very traditional as well, and almost like elements of magical realism by setting these fairy tales which have all the hallmarks of fairy tales that we've heard before, but putting them in this modern context, and that really works. And then interspersed in between these stories we have little inputs from the two women and their hopes and dreams for the baby. So what I really liked about this is not just that the writing's really interesting, the fairy tales themselves or the tales of these different people I really liked in and of themselves. I also liked what this collection is trying to say about the idea of truth and telling tales and telling stories, and how, in fact, if we tell each other stories, even if they didn't really happen, is that still not finding an element of truth? And can we not learn something about the world and about ourselves through fictionalised stories or fairy tales? So it's just a really beautiful, really I want to say magical, but it's kind of more philosophical. I really like the tone in the collection, and it's very well put together, and I was very impressed by it. Now a contender for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year, and in fact my only pick from the shortlist that I read that is on my favourite list of books I've read this year, and that is Cersei by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of Greek myths, focusing mostly, I suppose, on an element of the Odyssey. But what Madeline Miller has done is taken the story of Cersei, who is a nymph, she's a daughter of the sun god, and she's just looking at her story. So she appears in other tales. The main story she appears in is the Odyssey, and Odysseus and his men land on her island at one point. But what I really liked about this is not just that we're reframing these myths through a different person's perspective, but Madeline Miller really looks at this idea of immortality and how cruel the gods are and how bored they are and how much they play with mortals. And that's such a theme that you see in Greek myths. They are really selfish and they just don't care about humans. And it's really interesting to see Cersei as having a conscience and having a heart. You do really root for her. And I just liked the juxtaposition of that. I thought it read very well. I thought it was really easy to read, but also it felt very structurally accomplished. I think when I read Madeline Miller's first book, The Song of Achilles, I thought that was a really fun read, and I read it really quickly and I got really into it, but it didn't quite feel as literary, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, but it felt more plot focused and more about the characters, and this just feels like a step up. Now, for a book I haven't shut up about, and I'm very sorry, you're going to have to hear me talk about it again, and that is Lani by Max Porter. But I just really, really adore this book. And okay, fair enough, I really liked Max's first collection, Grief is the Thing with Feathers, which is sort of like, it's poetry, but it's almost genre defying in terms of a collection. This is not a book of poetry. This is a novel, or a novella, I suppose. But you can really see structurally the similar ways that he's working. I just find his language so beautiful and deep, like visceral, sumptuous. Like I really enjoy the images that he likes to play with in his writing. And although it is quite creative and funny, I feel like everything does really pack an emotional punch as well. I mean, Grief was obviously about a family going through grief, and in this story, the little boy Lani goes missing at one point. So it is like heart-stopping, certain aspects of it. But generally, we get this story from 3 different people's perspectives. We get Lani's mum, Lani's dad, and a guy called Pete who is teaching him art, who also lives in this village. So we get each of their 3 perspectives, and also this abstract, weird, omniscient character called Dead Papa Toothwort, who is like a green man, essentially. Like, he's like a spirit who has always lived in this village and listens to all the different people. And through him, you not only get some really amazing imagery about the countryside and other people's rubbish and things like that, you also get the idiosyncrasies and eccentricities of like an English country village, because he's listening to everybody. So you get little snapshots of people's opinions and half of their conversations about scones or about who's put on weight and all these different things. And I feel like this is the perfect mix of emotion and humour and wit, and also just really poetic and beautiful language. I can't get enough of it. And if you haven't read it yet, what are you doing? Like, have you listened to me? And finally, another book I'm afraid I have spoken about. I feel like I've spoken about a lot recently as well, and that's Spring by Ali Smith. Now, as you probably know, I'm sure you know, Ali Smith is doing a seasonal quartet. She's releasing a book a year. This is the 3rd in that series. So we have autumn, winter, and now spring. And each book, the plots are very different, the characters are very different. They don't really link. So you could just read one and let it be standalone. But thematically, they do all link, because each book somehow, although it's about other things and we follow different characters, feels like she's writing about this year and about the society, and in the UK at least, kind of just where we are. So Autumn, for example, was very much about Brexit. Elements of Winter really focused on environmentalism and I guess in a little bit touched upon truth, so kind of fake news. Spring takes that fake news element even further, and also looks at the legacy of the Windrush scandal and people being deported, so she's looking at detention centres in this book, but also lots of other things. I mean, that's just something that jumps out at me, but she manages to encompass so many different themes, and I couldn't even put into words all the different things she's touching upon in this book. But I will also say that if you don't really like Ali Smith's writing, which can be a little bit, of a certain taste, you're not going to like this. And that's fine. This isn't going to be the book to convince you suddenly that you love Ali Smith. And also, I think the reason I am so in awe of Spring particularly is because it's the 3rd one in the series, and each book I have loved more and more, because I feel like it's just cumulative. Like, what she's done, I just get more and more impressed. So probably Summer will be my favourite one of the whole quartet, I'm assuming. So I've had a bit of a funny start to the year, really. I feel like of these books, like these 5, I've absolutely loved. There's some books that I've really, really enjoyed this year, and some of my favourites like of all time. But apart from that, I feel like most of the other stuff I've read has just been okay, or actually quite bad. Like, I don't really feel like I've got a handle on loads and loads of new really amazing books so far. So hopefully the second half of this year will be the one to turn that around. So naturally, I would love to hear from you what your favourites have been this year, either stuff that's just come out or something old that you've just read and really, really loved. Like, give me your recommendations. I would love to talk to you as well about these books in the comments if you've read them, and see what you think about them. See, have I convinced you to read them if you haven't yet? And I will see you in my next video. Bye.